for being here today. I would assume that you are here for an audience with me because you have heard that I am setting sail back to England for a consultation, an audience as it were, with His Majesty King George III. I shall be setting sail very soon, my family as well. Some of it is in England and the rest shall follow along with me, including my staff. And let me just first say that it is with heavy heart that I leave. As governor of this province and as commander-in-chief of His Majesty's forces, in a duty that I thought was to protect the good people of this province from the threat of war. Sadly, that war has arrived. It is not through my doing. Events have caused this war to occur, and I mourn the loss of all soldiers who have fought at this point, whether they be the men of my command or whether they be men who have taken up arms in the various militia companies and regiments. I mourn them all on this most significant day. And tell you that I love Americans. I love the people of these colonies very much. In fact, since the war against the French and the Indians, I have left these colonies but one time in the most significant year of 1773. Does anyone know what occurred in 1773? I'm sure that you do. You were probably all safely in your houses, were you not? The unnecessary destruction. Yes, you may say it, madam. That is East India tea, I trust. Indeed. The unnecessary destruction of East India Tea Company, and of course, having had it being done, it could not help but be noticed by His Majesty's governments, and so many of them old stock in that very company and have done their level best to preserve it from some of its mistakes. I was in England at that time and had an audience with His Majesty. And we both came to the realization that the only way that the violence could be stopped and order be restored was for me to return, not to New York this time, or up to Montreal where I had been before, but this time to Massachusetts as your royal governor of this province. I have seen many battlefields, but perhaps what His Majesty appreciates about me most of all is that I am not so much a man of the sword, but a man of the quill. I'm a man who seeks negotiation, who seeks agreement with those who disagree with policies, and I have no anger towards those who disagree with policies. It is a natural thing in this day and age of the 18th century to have a voice and an opinion in politics. I fully understand that, having served in government myself. But what cannot occur is the violence that has occurred since those times. And I speak of this most recent year, the battles at Lexington and Concord, the one that was fought on Bunker Hill. I've been told by locals, however, that I should be calling it Breeds because that is where the battle was actually fought. Yet, to me, it was a peninsula and there was a large hill upon it. And if those who write of it wish to call it the Battle of Bunker Hill, then so be it. What saddens me is that we took it at a heavy cost to both sides, and good men died on both sides. A man who I disagree with politically, but have great respect for, died in that battle. You know him as Dr. Joseph Warren. A fine major of Marines, a Scotsman by the name of John Pitcairn, who was involved in the Battle of Lexington and Concord and fought bravely and commanded bravely, was also lost on that terrible day in June and died in the arms of his son. So I have seen enough battle, ladies and gentlemen, in my time, and I wonder what the audience will be like with His Majesty. Of course, when one is, as you know, in the presence of His Majesty, one, or perhaps you do not, you have not met him, but let me tell you that you do not speak until spoken to. Indeed, and with all of the proper bows and all of that, it must be done. But he is a good king. There are disagreements in Parliament, as there are always disagreements in government, are there not? I suspect there will be disagreements in government long beyond my time, and will continue because different people have different opinions. But the fact that we have tragically decided to fight it out with musket, bayonet, sword, and cannon is most regrettable indeed, because for a good portion of my life, I have done my level best to defend this empire, whether it be in Europe, in places such as Flanders, in England, Scotland, Canada, and now these colonies. Well, I had no choice. I was the second son of my father, and owning the estate was not to be my destiny. So as the second son, I had other choices. And of course, that would certainly rule out the ministry as well. That would be for a son of any family to follow. But as a young man, as the second son, I chose the military and found it to be much to my liking. You might have guessed, I hope I am neat in appearance. When I left my lodgings this morning, I was making my way here in this good town of Boston, which I will be departing from very shortly. I was a young officer, and I saw some of the worst that warfare in this time has to offer. I was part of the Great Battle of Fontenoy as a young man and as a staff officer, and saw a great deal of slaughter between ourselves and the French. It is indeed always the French, is it not? And then later, returning to England and our British Isle, I was involved in an uprising of Jacobites from Scotland in the Battle of Culloden. Another terrible slaughter. I have seen enough slaughter in my lifetime. And I was a young man, and I was being thrust forward up the ranks from an entry officer all the way up to the very top of command that I have now. I made my way to these shores in 1755 with General Braddock, and was involved in that terrible battle out on the frontier in which General Braddock was killed. His Majesty's forces were ambushed by the French and their Indian allies, and I was in the van of the column that was attacked and had to make decisions to save lives as General Braddock lay dying. But I had some assistance. How is history not odd? Are there not peculiarities to history that one thinks of? And I'm thinking of them now, most certainly, as I am still in Boston. I'm thinking of the fact that the young officer from Virginia that aided me in the rescue of the rest of the army is now the opposing commander on the outside, in Cambridge specifically, none other than Mr. Washington, who has taken command of the rebellious forces in the countryside that keep us shut in. There is such irony in history. And we were most successful by the end of that war, and I was involved in a number of other campaigns under General Amherst against the French and the Indians in various places, in which we finally removed most of the French forces from these colonies and from this part of the world. Places such as Montreal and Quebec and Crown Point, all of these campaigns in various forts, and all in service of defending all of you from the French and their Indian allies. So when I say that I love the people of these colonies, I truly mean it. Well, Samuel Adams and John Hancock, not so much. I choke up. I cannot even say John Hancock at this point. I still believe that there are a few ringleaders, if they were arrested, that the people would come to their good senses. But, of course, we are beyond that now, are we not? Blood has been spilled at Lexington and Concord and on the heights of the Charlestown Peninsula, so perhaps it is not too late, but there are arrangements that must be made, and that is what I will say to His Majesty when I return to England, still as your governor, as the royal governor here, and I will be turning over command to General William Howe. You see, perhaps you have seen this in your own life, is when it is viewed that you are in great difficulties, you are given reinforcements, and sometimes they become replacements, do they not? Well, after Lexington and Concord, reinforcements were sent during that lull before the Battle of Bunker Hill. Not only was I given more troops, I was given 3 more generals. Generals Howe, Burgoyne, and Clinton were all sent to aid me in my duties, and as I suspect, perhaps I was going to be recalled for an audience with His Majesty, and perhaps they felt a change in command at this time is best, but we shall see. But the troubles, you would think, would you not, ladies and gentlemen, that after a successful war of protecting these colonies, that there would be a time of peace and celebration, would you not? Yet that has not been the case. After the defeat of the French in 1763 and putting down Pontiac's rebellion on the frontier, it would seem that we could all raise a toast to our new monarch, His Majesty King George III, and I hope that you all still do that. Well, you're here visiting me, of course you do. To God save the King and all of that. Yet, I could see trouble. I eventually went from governing in Montreal to when General Amherst decided to go home, to replacing him as command of all of His Majesty's forces in this continent and being headquartered in New York City. Have any of you been to New York City? It is a bustling place, madam. Indeed, and there has been trouble there as well. There has been rioting during these times as well. Now, you are all good people. I know this. I was told before I arrived. Else, why would you come for an audience with me? And I think of my dear wife and my children, and I try to reassure them that there are still good people in these colonies. You know, my wife is from New Jersey. My wife is an American. A good lady from New Jersey, and has brought me forth a wonderful family. And I have, of course, already sent her and the children to safety and education for the young ones as well. And I shall see them soon after the voyage. But it was a matter of the need for money. Is it not always about money? It is indeed. I visit with my older brother when there are discussions of money at the estate at High Meadow, and as many families do, but governments need money, do they not? To pay off debts for wars fought where? In Europe, yes, as I have seen, but also here in these colonies, in the frontiers, and up in Canada, through New York and Lake Champlain and up towards Montreal and Quebec and beyond, out to the frontier to the west, where I was at the beginning of this conflict. Governments need money. And Members of government, such as the House of Commons, may disagree on where that money may come from and who should pay it, as should colonists. But in the end, as His Majesty's representative, I see no reason why the good people of these colonies should not help in paying for their own defense. And yet, when it comes time to pay for that defense, we hear arguments of Parliament having no right to tax these colonies. And I can tell you, going all the way back to Magna Carta onto the future, I have no idea where that argument may come from. Magna Carta provided for a representative government, not just a king or a queen, but a parliament of representatives, a House of Commons, a House of Lords, all beholden to each other and His Majesty with a ministry from the majority. Is that not a representative government? It represents the entire empire, not just those who reside in England. These colonies, Scotland and Ireland, and merely to pay a fair share for the debt incurred, for the maintaining of commerce, for the maintaining of soldiers on the frontier at forts, to protect the people of these colonies. It all seems so simple to me, madam. Should not the people here help pay for the soldiers that protect them? Why should a banker in England pay for soldiers stationed here? There are royal governors who may consult His Majesty and his government. There are agents who represent each colony in London. And yet we hear of the need for membership to the House of Commons, and then not even that. And then good and honest men, such as John Adams, write of the fact that Parliament has no right to tax and that the people here should be allowed to govern themselves. Well, my response to that is that there have been a number of incidents in the past 10 years that have put that thought into question. I could go through each and every tax act and put you to sleep, so I shall be brief. I'm a general. I'm used to being brief. I think of the Stamp Act of 1765, mere taxes on things such as dice, playing cards, college diplomas, marriage licenses, newspapers. With some of the things scribbled in these newspapers, sometimes I think they should be taxed more than they already are. For those of us, and this is a very learned group, so I'm sure you all read your newspapers, but all of these things, minor taxes, small taxes, taxes that help pay for your defense, soldiers and forts along the frontier to separate the Indians and the colonists, the need for people to be a part of a representative government. And in those days, I was very much in favor of a government of the freeholders, town governments, town meetings, although I find them a bit befuddling that every single person may stand up and sometimes they speak all together at town meetings. I am more used to the proper borough governments of England, but it is a difference of opinion, and I'm willing to acknowledge it if the people behave themselves. And then there is the General Court. The General Court, which resided in Boston until I moved it to Salem, where I moved the capital during the days after the tea destruction, it was very much the same thing, much bitter argument, much rancor against royal governors such as Francis Bernard and Thomas Hutchinson, merely for doing their duty. And yet there was violence. Many of you remember in Boston the violence of 1765 in August, the violence against the Stamp Act, violence against Governor Bernard and Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson. What kind of a man puts a mob together of people in Boston of the worst sort and attacks an official's house? Is there anything good to be said about a group of men, no doubt liquored up, making their way to the houses of men such as Andrew Oliver, the stamp master, attacking his house, cutting down his trees, emptying his wine cellar, destroying his carriage. And there's no thought of you being there that day, I would suspect. You look like a good, decent, honest man, so I would trust that you were not. And what of Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson, soon to be governor? Imagine someone swinging an axe at his front door, forcing his family to flee from its dinner table and escape out a back door and have his house completely ransacked, from furniture to paintings to his history of this province, thrown out on the street, wine cellars emptying, a continuing theme, and cutting down all of his precious fruit trees. These assassins went to the roof of his house and cut off the cupola from the rest of the house. And yet, the word is liberty. I have done my best to try to maintain the peace. And all of this was from New York. Why, when troops were sent in 1768, there were disputes over where to quarter them. I had to come from New York to Boston to help settle the issue between the town officials and the army. And it was eventually settled. And yet, having troops in Boston, which I thought best at the time, all it did was give Samuel Adams and his friends the opportunity to provoke the masses against them and to create that inevitable and terrible event. Anyone heard of it? Someone said it. The massacre on King Street. Yes, massacre indeed. There were 5, and they were among the crowd of instigators. They were among the mob. There had been 1 soldier that night. I was not here. I was in New York. But Colonel Dalrymple, who was in command, and others told me of what had happened. 1 soldier. Let us picture it. This 1 soldier outside of a sentry box, outside of the custom house. And at first, it was just a minor insult given by a young apprentice and his friend. The soldier drove them off with the butt of his musket. But there had been much milling about that night, if you know what I mean, in the streets of Boston, from the reports that I read. And there was much mischief. Many spirits were drunk. And they seemed to look for a way to try to provoke the soldiers, as they had been doing for 2 years. And this poor sentry was all by himself. You're a good, genteel people, but for purposes, think of yourselves as a mob. That poor soldier was standing outside the custom house by the House of Government, the townhouse. And he was all alone as this mob came at him. Does that sound fair? Much like the riots of 1765, mobs seemed to pick on individuals. And this poor soldier suddenly realized he could not defend himself and sent out, he could not get into the custom house. The door was locked, and no one would let him in. So he begged for help from the barracks. Captain Preston came out with 7 other soldiers. 9 soldiers against an angry mob with oaths. Certainly nothing to be repeated here in front of you good people. Threats. And if that was not enough, snow, ice, oyster shells, and rocks being thrown at these poor soldiers. Clubs, swords. And yet, supposedly, there had been church bells ringing, calling out to help put out a fire. Now, I am an honest man, sir, but you must answer this for me. How does one put out a fire with a club or a sword?
Carefully.
Indeed. And not very well, I would also submit. They were there for one purpose, disturbance. There was no fire. The church bell had been rung to bring them all together to form a mob against these soldiers. There is an inevitability to such things, perhaps much like Lexington Green, that eventually someone among the soldiers being hit or struck was going to fire. And this occurred, and that great tragedy unfolded, called the Massacre on King Street. And yet, when these soldiers were threatened to be hanged by the courts here, a good man stepped forward to defend them. Who is that good man, anyone? John Adams, indeed, sir. Well, in those days, but he has been lost in other thoughts these days. But in those days, he defended those soldiers, and that is what I am about as well. I am about the rule of law and would not like to see violence. I know that may seem odd coming from a soldier who commands other men to go to battle, as I did this past April. And he defended them well. From court proceedings, it was witnessed that only 2 of them fired with deliberation. Privates Montgomery and Kilroy, and they were punished with manslaughter and branded on the thumbs. And it was English law that saved their lives. And this was an English court in Boston, because they could have been hanged for manslaughter, but Mr. Adams pleaded benefit of clergy, an old English ecclesiastical law, and they were spared with nothing but more than brands on the thumb. And in the end, Mr. Adams and his friends got what they wanted, the soldiers out of Boston. But many people, and I'm still hoping for this in my present situation, in this October of 1775, but there were many people after that massacre who thought that the radicals, such as Samuel Adams, had gone too far. They had provoked this killing on King Street, and our royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson, was actually popular for a time, a very short time. And then he tried to enforce the royal payment of judges and the business with the tea, and he fell into disfavor once again to the point where he had to be recalled. Now, as I mentioned, in 1773, I was in England. And of course, I was in England tending to family affairs of business. And as I have imagined this, if this were you, as I've mentioned, I have spent so much time in these colonies that walking the streets of London, for me, seemed like a foreign country. I've been here since the beginning of the war against the French. I married here. I raised a family here. Montreal, New York, on to Boston. And there I was looking for men regarding business and my family, and there was so much bustle that I had difficulty finding them. London is a metropolis, the like of which the world has not seen since ancient Rome, and I found it that way myself. But I heard of the destruction of the tea, had an audience with His Majesty, and now he and his government of Lord North were ready to listen to my recommendations. The people of Boston have destroyed the tea, the non-loyal people of Boston, those that have created much distrust. So would it not stand to reason that the people of Boston should pay for the destroyed tea, the tea that they destroyed? One would think. Remember that Mr. Hancock that I had trouble saying his name? He's very wealthy, is that not so? Madam, why shouldn't he pay for the tea if he cares so much about all of you and all of the people of Boston and Massachusetts? Yet he has not. I also recommended later, after the Port Act of Boston, the Massachusetts Government Act. Many of the men who sit in these town meetings in the General Court are responsible for sending the men on those ships and causing the mob violence of the town of Boston. And they're spreading that pox out into the countryside. So it was my belief that a temporary restraining of the government of Massachusetts was necessary as well. Bring back a governor who will enforce the rule of law. Any candidates? Ben Franklin, indeed. The scientist and the man of knowledge. Well, I was chosen, sir. Perhaps because it was my advice that His Majesty was taking, and I had long experience with the people of these colonies. And then I arrived in May of last year, and I was greeted properly, so you need not be disappointed with that. But I sensed that our opinions on how things should be done were very different. The port to be closed June 1st, the government to be moved away from the mobs of Boston to the peaceful town of Salem to the north. I would eventually have to return it to Boston under threat, as I was in the country about Salem trying to be the governor of this province, and realized that I really needed to be under the protection of the Navy and most of my troops. So the government at this time has been moved back to Boston. And now think upon this, there has been much dispute over the royal paying of judges. So what have the courts been doing in the past year or so? Juries have not sat. The law has not been able to proceed, not even for John Adams. So if there is a capital crime, and I was thinking then, of a royal official, how could the courts try it if they would not sit? If they were in dispute with these royal judges. So I recommended another act which would send them to perhaps Halifax, Nova Scotia, or more likely back to England for trial with provision made for witnesses. Does that not sound fair? Silence, but I will take silence as agreement. And since it is the general courts who have approved of the unruliness of Massachusetts, I temporarily believe that we should have a mandamus from His Majesty for a council that will rule in its stead, but with the opportunity beyond this council for reason to prevail and a return of general courts in Salem last October, and that did not happen either. I have been befuddled by this matter. Every attempt to reach out and extend a hand to those who are in disagreement has been pushed back and refused. There is also the Quartering Act, necessary to find barracks for soldiers, who are the constables of our time, who put down mob violence. They are soldiers, but they must be barracked. And of course, I found Boston very cold in winter. But you are used to it. So perhaps you do not feel it as much as I do. But soldiers cannot, can they, sir? Can they survive in tents in January? Oh, indeed. You are a hardy one, sir. But most soldiers cannot. Most soldiers cannot survive in that and must have barracks for order and discipline. All well and good to have a tent in July, but not so much in January or February. So provisions by the good people must be for the soldiers to find places such as the manufactory building, as they did in 1768, and now to find barracks much the same. And should not an officer have fine lodgings in a home? I mean, I have province house, but my other officers must be provided for, the ones that are not barracked with their soldiers. These are simple things that must be done, as well as providing protection through the Quebec Act for those to the north, to keep them as loyal subjects as well, which has nothing to do with the people in these colonies, yet Samuel Adams, for one, viewed it as a threat against Protestantism by helping these Catholics to the north. And, of course, we have provided for the frontier a separation of the Indians and the colonists of these colonies who have been fighting each other since the good people have settled here. Have they not? Why not look for a way to keep us out of war rather than create a situation where it can occur generation by generation? And it is merely that which we believed would bring peace, and yet all we heard more was an infringement on their rights, the rights of the people, to the point where a Congress was held last September, a Congress of the colonies, except for Georgia. And there, I can only imagine that many lawyers in one room. They must have befuddled each other, because every man in these colonies, it seems to me, reads the law and uses it to his own ends. So I can only imagine a whole room full of them. And they met for 2 months, and they came to some agreements regarding non-importation, and they called themselves an association for it, and sent an address to His Majesty, which I can assure you he read. Probably did not like it, but I am sure he read it. They were assuming he would defend them against Parliament. But we are a constitutional monarchy. He could not do that. He is a part of the government. He is not the government. All the while, I could see in the countryside, militia companies were drilling. Provisions were made for minute companies at one point. Not muster days, twice a year or so, not once a month, but every week. Militia companies were drilling, forming minute companies. To drill that incessantly means that there is an enemy close at hand. Who might that be? The government, of which I represent. So I did what any responsible provincial governor and general of a garrison would do. I started to send soldiers out to take away these means of resistance: powder, musket balls, cannon. It was successful in Boston. And successful just outside of Boston, in Charlestown and Cambridge, in seizing powder and cannon. It did disturb the countryside, but it was successfully done. I was less successful in Salem. Word got out, perhaps after the overrunning of the fort in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, the previous December, this past February, Colonel Wellesley and troops left from the castle in the harbor of Boston and were landed in Marblehead to march to Salem to seize those stores. Yet there was an inlet of the sea with a drawbridge in their way, and the locals raised it so they could not cross, carted away their military stores, all an open act of rebellion. Yet Colonel Wellesley and the men showed great restraint in not firing. The same could not be said, unfortunately, on April 19th. I had sent men out to map the roads. My staff and I had planned what would be the perfect operation to Concord, to seize the stores there. We would march the men out, night of April 18th. We would keep everything quiet. We would quietly remove our best soldiers, our light infantrymen and grenadiers, from duties on April 15th before that. We would get the boats ready, as is normal practice, even before, at the beginning of April. But there are spies everywhere, are there not? From the mending of the boats to the relieving of these companies of soldiers, on to the very night of the 18th, all was spotted and known, and preparations were made to receive our troops. I sent out mounted patrols that night of the 18th to stop men such as Paul Revere from warning the countryside. And they had a great deal of success, but many men got through, which is why on that next day of the 19th of April, so many militia companies mustered, and their minute companies as well, to take shots at my soldiers. Death and destruction. Oh, if I could have been there on Lexington Green to prevent that. 2 companies of our light infantry were on the green, while 4 others were behind, as well as the main body of the soldiers. We had about 800 soldiers, as I recall. If only those men on Lexington Green had laid down their arms. and dispersed. Now, they were beginning to disperse, but they did not lay down their arms, and the depositions I have read still, sir, do not clearly tell us who fired that first shot. The British Army is the best trained army in the world. I find it hard to believe it was one of my soldiers or one of my officers. That is what my depositions tell me. I would not even say that it was the men of the Lexington militia, or training band as they call themselves, on the green. I think it was someone out on the fringes of the town common. Do you not think so? That popped a shot? I do indeed. And yet that terrible day began. And despite the protests of junior officers, Colonel Smith continued on his mission to seize arms in Concord. And you know the rest of the story of that terrible day. The fighting that occurred at the North Bridge, because it was all about seizing those bridges so that the militia could not intercept our columns and we could proceed through Concord, seize the stores, and return to Boston. That was the plan. But an assault was made on the North Bridge. Shots were exchanged. Once again, we know not who fired first. We shall have to read the depositions again, I suppose. It has been rumored that one of my men fired first at the North Bridge and that the colonists fired back. My men retreated back into town, and along with the grenadier companies, the light infantry companies, made their way back to Lexington, whence they came, under fire the entire time. It seemed like all of Massachusetts, every town in Massachusetts, had raised its militia companies to fire at my men. And there was much loss of life. And earlier that morning, I sensed trouble, and that is when the order of sending Lord Percy and the 1st Brigade. They left that morning, and they were there just in time in the early afternoon to save Colonel Smith and his men. And after some rest, with Lord Percy now in command, they made their way all the way back to Boston. Interesting, though, that eventually, before being crossed over back to Boston, where were my soldiers? On the Charlestown Peninsula in April. Perhaps looking back, it would have been best to keep them there so we would not have to take that hill again as we did last June. After much loss of life, once again, particularly with our troops. And I say our with great sadness, because I still think of you good people as I prepare to depart and make my way across the ocean back to England to be with my family and my dear wife, but most important of all, to have an audience with His Majesty to give my report. That I still think of us all as blood of one blood, all Englishmen. And it is my hope that despite what has happened in the fields around Lexington and Concord, and on that hill on the Charlestown Peninsula, that we may still come back together as one people, as one good English people. And that is my hope. But I suspect that with my voyage, I will be returning to England, and I will not be coming back, and that command will be left to others. Hopefully not to prosecute a war, but to come to some sort of agreement with the colonists here. And with that, I must depart. But I thank you all very much for visiting me and seeing me off. General Thomas Gage. Indeed. Commander and Royal Governor of this province. Now, my real name is Michael LePage, and I was asked to play His Majesty's General, Servant of the Crown, and Provincial Governor today. But of course, I look around and see all of you, and I see what is behind me, And as an American, the next most important thing of all I must do is thank all of you veterans in this room for your service for our great country. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for your sacrifice. And of course, as things will go on, this will become an American story, will it not? As General Gage feared, the war will go on, and it will become a war of independence, one that we will win with great loss of life and with a great deal of help from the French and Dutch loans. I say this because I also play John Adams. And you probably saw me a while back as Paul Revere. But it is a story of America because we were English settlers and English subjects, and we felt wronged, and you all seem to take all of my arguments very well, and I thank you for that. But if I come back as John Adams, those arguments will be very different, you understand. But regardless of whether we were still colonies going on to become Americans when we declared our independence, there was much sacrifice made by soldiers and sailors of both sides. And in the future, we will go on to future wars as Americans, and we will include airmen as well, and men of all of the services, for which I am most grateful, because without your sacrifice, I would not be up here doing this, interpreting history. Are there any questions? Yes, madam.
General, I had heard about your wife and how possibly she was giving some information to pictures, and I just wondered if her helpfulness was possibly perceived not so much as possibly one of the.
That's a wonderful question. I'm going to answer it out of character because there has been new history regarding it. And there have been many fine researchers. There's one particular name, J.L. Bell, who if you, I believe you can consult Dr. Google, and it is Revolutionary Boston. If you look up his name, you'll find his blog. And he has basically researched that story and said that it never happened. Now, it's a wonderful story. Most scholars believe now that she did not betray her husband. They actually had another child when they returned to England, so, I mean, I'm not sure there was that much betrayal. And there was thought that she was put back on a ship because he was angry with her, but he was also, I think he was really protecting her from the violence, from the threat of disease. And as I say, they went on to add on to their family when he returned to England. But she was from New Jersey. She was from Brunswick, New Jersey. So we are welcome to speculate. And of course, there is something that came up in her journal, quoting Shakespeare, about having to choose sides. And that's where a lot of that comes from. Now, we're all readers and writers. There's a difference between writing something in your journal and acting upon it, because members of her family were on his staff as well, brothers and cousins, and were in the army as well. I had a young lady and I played General and Mrs. Gage, and we did a great deal of research, and she actually contacted the Gage family itself in England. There's no evidence of any wrongdoing by Mrs. Gage. There's just, from what I've read, that journal entry. And for someone from New Jersey, whose husband is Commander-in-Chief of Crown Forces in America, and then eventually provincial governor of Massachusetts, it must have been very difficult for her. So where do we write our deepest thoughts? If we keep journals, that's where we write them. So there's no proof that she acted. And To me, it was, if I can use a phrase, being a cat owner, the cat was already out of the bag. There was evidence. And of course, when I was mentioning the fact that the Royal Navy was working on longboats in front of the entire town at the beginning of April, sign number one. That was when Paul Revere made his first ride out to Concord. April 15th, those boats that night were moored alongside the ships of war. Revere rode the next day on Sunday at the request of Dr. Warren to meet with Samuel Adams and John Hancock in Lexington. Earlier that day on the 15th, the elite companies of every British regiment are the light infantry and grenadier companies of a regiment. They were all relieved of duties and were supposed to learn, if I may use this, new evolutions, which fooled no one. The light infantry and grenadier companies are the best soldiers in every regiment. The light infantry are the most agile, physically fit younger men, and the grenadiers were the biggest and the strongest. When important operations were to happen, it was tradition in the British Army to put all of those elite companies together for some special purpose. So that was also an obvious sign. And the fact that there was a great deal of people talk, do they not? Whether it is here, at the office, at home, out at the pub, many times talking too much. There were officers seen going to the ends of wards, talking to each other in earnest, or in the back of a barn where their horses were being brushed. There were spies everywhere. There were spies as far out as Concord who were reporting to General Gage. There were spies for Dr. Warren's network reporting on what the soldiers were doing. And maybe it's because I already played him here. I mentioned Paul Revere once again. Over the winter before Lexington and Concord, men of Boston like Paul Revere, mechanics who had worked all day, would take turns watching the soldiers at night. So intelligence was constantly being gathered. So there's no proof that she did anything. But what the soldiers were going to do was very well known, which is why the whole lantern system at Old North Church happened, because they knew the soldiers were marching soon, and Paul Revere was worried he was going to get captured. So I think we've saved the lady's reputation. She stayed loyal to her man.
How long was your trip to England?
It depends. And, I've researched voyages going back to the times of the Mayflower. It tended to be, because of the Gulf Stream, quicker to go back than to go. It could be 1 month, it could be 2 months, it could be anywhere in between. It depended on the time of year, wintertime, or summertime, or, of course, fall and spring, but fall particularly could be nasty with storms that we're so used to here. So anywhere between a month to a month and a half to 2 months. And this is, I'm trying to conjecture from my notes. For him, I think he left in October, and he arrived sometime in December. But I'm not positive on that. Well, 6 survived to adulthood, and I'm trying to remember from my notes. I believe they had anywhere between 10 to 11 children. So, and they had one when she returned. So it's another reason why people don't think she was a traitor. He returned, and he kept the title of governor of Massachusetts, royal governor of Massachusetts. And then at some point, he was reactivated as a general when there was a threat of a French invasion during the war, and then retired and For those of you who love things like the fact that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died on July 4th, 50 years after, General Gage died in 1787. A very important year for us, our Constitution. The ironies of history are wonderful. Madam? Oh, yes. Well, this is called a gorget. It is an ornament, but it is an officers wear these. I'm so glad you asked this, because this is another part of the story of warfare in that time. This denotes rank. It goes, its heritage goes back to medieval times and being something to protect the throat in this area. But eventually it just became one of the things as an officer to wear. But of course, there's an unsporting thing about wearing this. When polished properly, it's shiny. And if you're fighting a battle, you can get picked out, which is what happened at Lexington and Concord and on the battle on Breed's Hill. Is those Yankees took particular pleasure, the perfect thing to aim at, is it not? Which is why eventually, as the war progressed, officers tried to blend in by the color of their coat, by wearing gorgets, by wearing fancy hats. Not. All of those things would start to come off as the war was fought. Gorgets, fancy hats, gold lace, because they were being picked out. It's something not known in European battles. And how do you tell someone not to shoot at an officer? I mean, I'm sure that there were shooting at officers in Europe. Don't get me wrong. But there's so many accounts of fancy things such as this gorget, this hat, and all the gold lace. There's an officer. What happens if you shoot and kill an officer or wound him and take him out of the battle? You cause disorder. So that's why it was done. So you can research the uniforms, and to adapt to fighting here, these hats for many regiments would become round hats. These breeches would become trousers for many regiments. Lace would come off coats. Gorgets would stop to be worn so officers could not be picked on. Because you shoot officers, it's like shooting a drummer as well, or the one carrying the colors. You're breaking down the organization of the other side. So many adaptations were made for comfort, but also for intelligence. Well, since I'm out of character and we're all being honest, this is actually not a general's coat, it is a captain's coat, which I borrowed this very morning from the captain in my regiment, because when I'm not playing John Adams and Paul Revere, guess what I play? A private soldier. So I'm borrowing my captain's coat to play General Gage before you today. Not being a military uniform expert, it would just be a matter of epaulets and things of that nature. You know, going on to what would happen in our military with being able to tell rank by shoulder boards, epaulets, etc.